Kaylin.
Ok, muchas gracias, Keila.
Buenos días, good morning.
Buenos días. Buenos días.
I am Maria Ramos Underwood, and I will serve
Yo
as
soy María
moderator.
Sanderwood y yo soy Marcela.
Thank you for joining us
Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros
to learn more about the housing crisis in Oregon.
para aprender más sobre la crisis de vivienda en Oregón.
Affordable quality housing is a desperate need throughout our country.
A través de todo el país hay una gran necesidad de vivienda de calidad.
But our Latinx community has distinct and
Nuestra comunidad latina tiene sus propias necesidades muy diferentes
the
o
National Low Income
características.
Housing Coalition
La
2020
coalición de vivienda del 2020
Out of Reach study reported that Oregon had the
nos
13th
reportó que Oregón tiene el 13,
highest housing wage in Oregon.
la brecha, el 13º lugar de la brecha diferente de vivienda, discrepancia de vivienda en Oregón.
Meaning that an individual
Eso
earning
quiere
minimum wage
decir que el salario mínimo
had to work 81 hours per week to afford a two-bedroom rental.
tiene que trabajar 81 horas a la semana para poder pagar la renta mínima de 2 recámaras.
This is an unfolding crisis.
Esta es una crisis frente a nosotros.
Parents working 2, 3 jobs
Los
and
padres que
cohabitating,
trabajan 2, 3 trabajos diferentes en nuestra comunidad
with family and friends to afford a roof over their heads.
y viven 2 o 3 familias para poder pagar, tener un techo que los cubra.
With no hopes of savings for
Sin ninguna
homeownership of
esperanza
their own,
de poder ahorrar hacia una propiedad o pagar una propiedad, una casa propia.
or for college or for retirement,
O para el colegio de los niños o para su propio retiro.
which we heard earlier from Dr. Lopez are key to wealth building.
Lo que el doctor López dijo es una clave básica para la acumulación de riqueza.
This calamity is layered on decades of inequitable practices.
Y esta calamidad tuvo el fundamento en una serie de prácticas calamitosas en el pasado.
Redlining and above market loan rates for communities of colors.
De obstrucciones que ha habido y en las limitaciones que hay para la obtención de vivienda de las comunidades de color.
As Dr. Lopez shared, our community does not have the benefit of wealth starter kits.
Como dijo el doctor López, nuestras comunidades no tienen esa base que tienen las otras comunidades blancas de iniciar tener riqueza, como el tener acceso a propiedades.
And have suffered from these wealth stripping practices.
Y han sufrido de estas prácticas que les roban de esas oportunidades.
The pandemic and the Alameda fire in Talenton, Phoenix.
La pandemia y los fuegos en Alameda y en Talenton, Phoenix
Revealed the perils of our housing crisis.
pusieron al descubierto los peligros de nuestra crisis de vivienda.
Our community has higher COVID infection rates.
En nuestra comunidad tiene los niveles más altos de infecciones de COVID.
And year after year, and a year after the fire, many families of color still don't have stable permanent housing.
Y año tras año y un año después de los fuegos, nuestra comunidad no tiene vivienda permanente todavía.
Many of these families lost everything and remain ineligible for FEMA support.
Muchos de estas familias perdieron todo y siguen siguiendo sin calificar para los apoyos de FEMA.
This environmental catastrophe is a wealth black hole for our families.
Esta catástrofe es un hoyo negro para la acumulación de riqueza de nuestras familias.
The call for change is urgent.
Es urgente que haya cambios.
To help advance our work,
para ayudarnos a que avance nuestro trabajo,
we have assembled a panel of experts to guide us on our path.
Hemos ensamblado anteriormente en nuestro pasado y ahora una comunidad de ciertos expertos que están aportando sus ideas.
With us today is Erica Ledesma from Fortaleza in Southern Oregon,
Con nosotros el día de hoy está Erika Ledesma del sur de Oregon.
Ubaldo Hernández, Comunidades Community Organizer from Hood River,
Ubaldo Hernández, organizador de comunidades de Hood River.
Erika Calderón, Housing Director at Bienestar in the Portland metro area,
Erika Calderón, que es la directora de la área metropolitana de...
and Chelsea Bunch, Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Officer at Oregon Housing and Community Services. We have curated questions for our panelists, and you will have an opportunity to ask your questions at the end of the presentation. With us today is Kaylin. Thank you, Kaylin, from the Oregon Community Foundation, who will help us manage our conversation. Thank you, Kaylin. Let's get started. The first question is for Erica Ledesma. Hi, Erica. From your perspective as a community organizer, how has the pandemic and the wildfires impacted the community in Southern Oregon? What do you see and hear from community members themselves?
Thank you, Maria. Good morning, buenos dias, everyone. I just want to take a deep breath, just to talk about the pandemic, but also the wildfires the past year. There's been a lot of loss. And it's Day of the Dead. So, just a moment to honor, our loss that we've experienced these last 2 years. I know a lot of our communities and families lost relatives, to the pandemic. And so I just wanted for us to take a moment to breathe and honor our loss and grief. And so, the year 2020 has changed our lives forever. The pandemic has pushed us to grow in so many ways than we have never imagined. The wildfires of September have changed the lives of so many. In one night, our families have lost everything that they had built for the last 15 to 20 years. Their sense of safety and home was gone in flames. And so I think in order to understand the impact that the fire had, I think we have to put it in the context of the pandemic, So in March of 2020, I was working at Eagle Point High School. So I worked in education, before some of this work. And I remember, when the pandemic started, it took a while for us to sink in the reality of it. And then in a couple of days, they announced the quarantine. And so we weren't prepared, all the students were sent home. And the reason that I'm talking about the schools is that so many families rely on the education system here in the state to provide resources, support, for families. And so when schools were shut down, that was daycare for many families. They relied on breakfast, lunch to feed their children. I kept hearing from, mothers that had to, reduce their hours in order to stay home with their young children to take care of them, but also to make sure that they were getting online to participate with online schooling. And so we had a lot of layoffs. And, the Latinx community are essential workers. So, think about it. People had to work, but also a lot of times they weren't even being protected in their workplace. And so we kept hearing, a lot of cases in Harry and David. My mother has worked there for 11 years. And when someone got COVID, they didn't even notify the assembly line. They just kind of isolated the person and they took their time off in quarantine. And so imagine just like, oh, what happened to that worker? There weren't many protections for workers. And so all of that was kind of happening. And then September, the wildfires happened. I think it's easy to be optimistic and hope for recovery, but the truth is that not everyone's going to be able to recover from this if we don't provide solutions for the socioeconomic inequities that exist. So, I kind of just want to talk about that, but the pandemic and the wildfires really brought up a lot of stress and psychological trauma, and also like that layer of health impacts because of the smoke. We already had a vacancy rate of 1% for the past 5 to 7 years here in Jackson County. And so we knew that when this fire happened, that it was already going to be such a struggle for people to find affordable housing or also something temporarily. And so Jackson County accounted for 60% of the losses. There were around 2,500 structures that were lost, and about 1,700 of those were mobile home parks. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Jackson County or even Southern Oregon, but the Almeda fire that went through Ashland, Talent, Phoenix, and Southern Medford, those mobile home parks were well known for the Latino community. I had relatives that had lived there for 20, 25 years. My cousins that was like their first home once they were born. They went there. That was like the first place that they ever were aware of, and they called home. And so I think when we think about the fire, it's like thinking about the equity that was lost in that fire, that community will never be able to recuperate, and so, I guess for me, when we're thinking about that is people weren't landowners, they owned their mobile home. The people that own homes, they're recovering, they're rebuilding, but the people that lived in mobile homes, they didn't own the land. They only owned their mobile home that were like 70s or 60s. So it cost about $30,000 to purchase one. Now if people want to buy a mobile home, they're looking at $150,000 to $175,000 to replace a manufactured home. And so that's kind of, considering where people, where they work, especially a lot of seasonal workers, it's really hard to, be able to purchase a mobile home. And so I guess I don't want to ramble around, because I think that this is like such a complex issue. And so I think when we think about reimagining a recovery, we have to make sure that there are solutions that strike at the root cause, of housing, but also this intergenerational poverty. It's like, how can we lift people out of intergenerational poverty? And it's thinking about solutions that pave the way towards home ownership, and also providing resources that allow families to move towards that. People loved the trailitas because they owned it. They had a sense of dignity. That was their home. They're like, I own this home, and this is what I provide for my family. And they loved it. And it wasn't only just the mobile home in that area, it was community, so there were so many social connections within those neighborhoods. People had their babysitters there, people carpooled together to work. And so in that fire, people also lost that sense of community and relationship. And so I guess I'll leave it for there, because then sometimes I get like in tangents.
Thank you, Erica. Thank you for grounding us in taking a breath. This is really difficult, challenging, complicated work to unpack. And so the breathing, I needed that reminder. So thank you, Erica. And thank you for reminding us that our families in Jackson County lost more than their homes, they lost their communities. And when we think about what Dr. Lopez said in the opening around centering solutions to the needs of the communities, how do we recreate that community? Because that was a protective factor as well. So we're going to move on to Chelsea. And the question I have for you, Chelsea, is, to Erica's point, how do we center the needs of community of color in making long-term investments in sustainable, affordable housing solutions? That's a big question for you, but let's see.
It is a big question. Good morning, everyone. It's really great to be with you all today. Chelsea Bunch, and I'm the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Officer with Oregon Housing and Community Services, and just really grateful to be with you all today. Erica, so much appreciation for you for centering community, for really honoring those who have come before us. I'm a firm believer in that. We walk in the path of our ancestors. And so I'm just really grateful for the breath and allowing us to just settle in and focus. So much appreciation to you. It is a big question, and it is the right question to be asking. And so, when I think about housing inequities. I think particularly as a representative of state government, it's really important that state government, and I'll very specifically call out OHCS, that we acknowledge our role in creating the historical inequities that we're seeing today. So I think, what Erica, what you brought up around the pandemic, the inequities that communities have been seeing have always been there. And yet the pandemic really put a laser focus on it, right? It became much more explicit, I think. And so I think for those of us, who are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian American, Pacific Islander, Latinx, we've experienced this for generations, right? And so I think it's always first to be honest about how we got here, and government has played a major role in that. I think what you all are bringing up, and certainly what we've seen, is that really across the board, when it comes to housing, and in other places too, but housing it's very much so specific, right? We see BIPOC communities facing persistent poverty and wage gaps that it really cause families to spend more money on things like rent, leading to housing insecurity. So all of this is contextual when we think about what happened with the wildfires in Southern Oregon, and as we think about kind of what folks are experiencing, in terms of the pandemic, that we've been dealing with ongoing discrimination, and that's in addition to just systemic barriers. And let me really specifically call out that this is all a product, and we talk about root cause, it's all a product of very intentional and specific systemic racism and institutional racism. And so when I think about those root causes, it's always really important to honor that and to call that out. And I think in terms of solutions, it's really interesting that we talk about solutions. And I think about as a representing OHCS, and we've long said, especially since we put out our statewide housing plan, that we really are committed to intentional and data-driven approaches, right? And in my mind, data-driven is not just about the numbers. I think there's plenty of numbers out there to show what I've already mentioned around housing instability, housing cost burdens. But data also really needs to include qualitative data. And that means we actually have to go and talk to people and not just talk to people, but we have to sit down and be quiet and actually listen. I think for me, both personally and professionally, the solutions are there. We just have to listen to what community says, and we have to be willing to enact the change that we hear coming from community. And so I think, when I think about how I call us as state government into this, we have to call ourselves into doing more than just the listening, but then taking what we're hearing and actually moving towards action, right? And so that's, as we develop policy, it's as we develop program, but it's also in terms of how we hold ourselves internally accountable to doing so, right? And so how are us as state agencies really centering equity and racial justice in our work? How are we making sure that staff are prepped and ready to be able to do that and to ask the intentional questions, to go out and really truly engage? We talk a lot about being in right relationship with community, and the only way that we can be in right relationship is if we actually have some conversation. So I think, for us, that's really looked at internally, trying to really build up our staff capacity to do more centering, right? How do we have conversations that center race and center the intersection of race and identity? And how do we have conversations about what are the specific questions that we need to ask when we're actually building programs where there's specific impact to communities? And so on kind of on the external side of things, that looks like we have to start targeting our dollars, right? As we look towards building affordable housing. We need to be asking some specific questions of our developers. We want to know, how are you engaging with the community? How do you know that the building that you're hoping to build is actually reflective of that's very specific community need? right? And so how are we encouraging developers to be in partnership with community, not just performative, but that actually might mean you might need to pay some people, and really provide the financial capacity, because money talks. Whether we want to admit it or not, it talks. And so we should be resourcing community to be a part of those solutions. I think, specifically thinking about the impact that wildfire has had on wealth building, I think wealth building is certainly, it's not, home ownership is not the only way, but it is a huge way that we can be really supporting ongoing generational wealth building. I know as a young girl, my dad always used to tell me, you got to own some land. And I, in college, I'm like, nah, I know it's important, but I don't think it's been until recently, and until I bought my first home, that I really understood what that meant, right? It allowed me to go back to school. It allowed me to make some improvements on a home, to build more equity, right? And everyone should have that opportunity to do that, right? And so I think knowing that home ownership, is one of the biggest assets for folks, it's really one of those intentional ways that we can prioritize, that we should be thinking about how we prioritize BIPOC communities. So, I think it's a bit of a shift, I think, for us as a state agency, but we're trying to think about and trying to utilize some new resources that we've received out of this last 2021 long session, around providing more grants for down payment assistance. Down payment assistance is huge, right? Because if you don't have enough down payment assistance, then the private mortgage insurance kicks in, right? And that just adds to that makes your mortgage more expensive. And that's not what we want, right? But also, home ownership prices have skyrocketed. And so when you're talking about putting 20% down, very few people have 20% down. And so I think for us, I think we hold it as a responsibility to be able to provide some resource to help meet that gap so that people can move into home ownership. I think it also is important for us to be providing support. And this is one of those places that I think we're also leaning into, for local community-based organizations, specifically culturally specific organizations who really reflect the community that they're serving in identity. And so how are we making sure that we're supporting capacity building for those organizations to lean into the solutions that we know that they know are the right solutions to support folks who are interested in home ownership? And really specifically calling out, who it is we're talking about when we're talking about BIPOC communities. I think one other thing I would just want to mention in terms of like, what are some of the strategies and the things that we need to do? And I'm thinking about programs. I really want to elevate like the IDA, the Individual Development Account Match Savings Program. Huge. We work with fiduciary organizations across the state to support match savings programs. And they're really important because, one, it's always important for folks to be able to have some sort of rainy day fund in the event that wildfires, because we know the way climate change is moving, it's here, it is upon us. And so this is, the wildfires that we're experiencing in Southern Oregon, this is certainly not going to be the last of that, I think. And so how are we able to support folks in building a nest egg for emergencies? But it's also a really great way to save for down payment. It's really great for using it to start up a small business, right? Something that you can take great pride in and then pass that along to your children and to those who come after you. And so I think that there's a number of different opportunities for us to really very explicitly and very tangibly create some change. And we also have to start off with just acknowledging how we've been a part of the problem. And I want to just really go back to, we also need to sit and listen to community, because they've had solutions all along, right? So it's not like we're coming to say, tell us your new ideas. Oh, they've had ideas. We just need you to listen. So I'm kind of like Erica. I'll get off on all kinds of tangents, and so I'll leave it there. But I'm really excited to continue that conversation.
Thank you, Chelsea. And I saw on the chat already more conversations about the IDA match savings program. So we'll have some questions for you at the end about that. That elicited some lots of interest. And I put a note for myself too, to find out more about that program. So thank you. Let's move to Ubaldo. Ubaldo, you know what the planners of our gathering together, you know, are just really curious from your perspective, how has the pandemic and the wildfires affected renters of color, particularly Latinx renters of color? If you could share that with the participants today, would be wonderful. Thank you, Ubaldo.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you everybody for being here. Yeah, one of the things that I'm going to talk about is a little bit of a different perspective, because the community where I live, we have not been affected by the fires per se. We were affected by smoke, but not by the fires. But one of the things that we have encountered on this area with the housing problem is that we are losing the affordability of this housing. Through COVID, it amplified the crisis. It didn't create the crisis, it just amplified it. It made things clear how the problems are on our communities everywhere and on the country. So in our communities, one of the things that we want to talk is about the importance of providing access to affordable housing to our communities. In Hood River, we have a lot of families that they are exposed to predatory practices. Unfortunately for us, all these real estate agents, developers, they're predators, they're economic predators to our communities. They abuse the Latino community, asking for a lot of requirements, paying extra money for services. If people want to rent a house, and we have a family that was homeless for a year and a half because they couldn't afford to rent a house. Because one other thing is there is a family of 5. People don't want to rent to big families. Then they ask for criminal background checks for everyone and the family, even kids. And these things cost money, and they were not refundable money for them. So this family, one of many, they have to split for a year and a half, living with different relatives so they can find a place to live. They finally found a place to live, but it was not even close to something they were looking for. They're living in the Washington side of the gorge in a single white trailer, 6 members of the family now because they brought the grandma to the family in a single white. A year and a half, a family that spent moving around between families. They were homeless. They were homeless for a year and a half, and they couldn't afford to rent a house that provide them a house with dignity. So this is one of the examples that many families experience in the state of Oregon. This is not just the Hood River or the Dells area or the Gorge area. This is everybody on the state of Oregon, every Latino family. The other thing is, and something that we need to talk about when we talk about affordable housing affordability, is we need to talk about undocumented families, because we always talk about that we need to work with the community, but we never specify the undocumented families that are affected by it. And this is something that we need to make a statement that undocumented families, they pay taxes. Everybody in this country pay taxes, and they pay taxes, and they are the less, the community that receive the less in services back. So if we really want to make a difference, we need to talk about specifically undocumented families, undocumented workers, because that's who we are. We are undocumented workers. We came to this country to work, and we produce, we provide to the culture, we provide to the economy of this nation, and we receive nothing in return. One of the things that one of the things I like about the Oregon, the governor, Jay Inslee, last year in a meeting with the Latino community, he recognized that undocumented Latinos pay taxes and they got nothing in return. And that needs to change, but also needs to change from our perspective as a social activist and advocates. We need to ensure that everybody talk about the undocumented immigrants, because we always come out with these great projects, great ideas, and describe our situation as a Latino community, but we never specified that undocumented community is the one who has suffered the most. So also, there is a lot of support from foundations that help organizations like us to fight for their rights, but also this foundation needs to put a lot of emphasis in working with undocumented immigrants too. This is one of the things that our communities are full of. The majority of our communities are undocumented immigrants that produce, that work. Their kids are not undocumented, but the family is undocumented by default. It doesn't matter if you were born here, but if your parents are undocumented, you are undocumented. You cannot access to some services because your parents are undocumented. And this is something that we need to talk. And this crisis, housing crisis, is increased because of those status, undocumented status. We need information for our people, and we need information that reach their houses, reach their works, because we don't know what we're fighting for if we don't know our rights. I have been talking to a lot of people about the housing crisis in Hood River and the Dells, and they don't know what they're expecting from the law. So they don't know what they need to ask for if they don't know what they deserve or what the society offers to them or the system offers to them. So the other thing is, and I heard this, housing with dignity. I've been in a few panels with different agencies, state agencies, and in one of those panels, one of the organizations showed a picture about affordable housing and how it looks like. And the first reaction was, that doesn't look like affordable housing. And to me was what affordable housing looks like. You know, we need to think about affordable housing has to be a housing with dignity, because we are not up to be living, and not to say they're not a great places, but trailer parks, you know, community complex where you have houses with 2 rooms and complexes, you know, where it's 100 families. So that's not necessarily affordable housing. Affordable housing has to look like a place where people has dignity, live with dignity, feels like they've been respected. They have a clean area, they have their own space, not just because we are dumped in a complex and that's affordable housing. That has to change. And one of the things also, when we are talking about how we perceive affordable housing and the crisis, people say, oh, we don't want to make this political. Well, sorry, but this is political for us because that's the way we perceive the oppression. We cannot say that, oh, those lenders are not predators, because they are predators to us. And this is our reality. And we need to be able to express ourselves the way we feel without for us to be put into, oh, you are political, you are too political. No, we are not political. We are talking about our reality. That's our reality in our communities. That's why we have this family of 5 living a year and a half homeless. And it's not just the family, but multiple families that they're living homeless right now. A lot of people, they said, well, we don't see Latinos living on the streets. Because our culture, we accept other people to come and live with us. If we have 2 rooms, 2 bedrooms, we split it and we live together there. That's why we're not homeless, but that doesn't mean that person is not homeless. And this is one of the things that we have to see and demonstrate that the way we perceive our community, our society, we're more empathic. We embrace our community. We don't let them sleep on the streets. But we are homeless. There is, I was talking to a group of seniors and Latino seniors in Hood River, and they told me, Ubaldo, I don't want to live with my kids. I want to have my own apartment, but I can't afford. They're still working. It's not people that they're not working. They're still working, but they can't afford to have their own place, and they have to live with their families. And that thing creates another crisis when families live together for many years with a lot of people in one small space. So one other thing is the crisis that we are living right now with affordable housing. It's not just created by the fires. It's not created by the smoke of COVID. This crisis has been here for years and years, and our Latino community has been the most affected by it. And so for me, it's really important to, as organizations, as foundations, to turn an eye and look also the term undocumented. And undocumented communities, they need the support and they need to be recognized and they need to be part of these benefits. Because I see also a lot of organizations that they always say, oh, but you're undocumented, you cannot access to this. And remember, being undocumented, that doesn't mean your family is whole and documented. You can have kids that were born here, but even though you can be tagged as undocumented if your parents are not documented immigrants. And
Thank
so
you.
we need a lot of support. Thank you.
Thank you, Ubaldo. I took lots of notes. I think you made so many good points about centering the needs of undocumented families. Thank you for that. I think every time this is the whole onion analogy. There is always another layer that we could be asking who is missing, whose voices are missing. Thank you for centering that voice. And thank you for introducing the concept of housing with dignity, because that we need, I think, to get the definitions and to keep asking the questions, what are we missing in our definitions, is incredibly important in this work. So thank you, Ubaldo. Let's move on to Erika Calderon. And Erika, Bienestar builds affordable housing for the Latinx community in Washington County. Can you share what the affordable housing crisis looks like in your community? What are the barriers to owning a home? And then we want to hear from you about the significant lack of Latinx developers and how we can build a plan to increase the numbers of builders in our community who understand our Latinx community, and particularly back to Ubaldo's presentation about the needs of undocumented families. Let's hear from you. Thank you, Erika.
Hi, thank you for having me. Good morning. As a developer, I hear all, starting from Erika to Chelsea to Ubaldo, I was just like, oh, solutions or education, or, you know, I wish I had like an hour to sit here and I feel like we could solve some of this home, you know, the housing crisis. So once again, Erika Calderon with Bienestar. We're an owner, operator, developer of affordable housing, and this is our 40th year. So currently, we own 500 units of affordable housing and serve about 2,000 families. About 95% are Latinx that live currently in our portfolio. So thank you, Maria. To start off with your first question, you asked, like, what is the homeless crisis looking like right now in Western Washington County? I think as a developer right now, what I seek out most when I reach out to community, what Chelsea was talking about earlier, right? Those who hold power right now that can build for the community, like how are they reaching out? I definitely reach out. It's very time consuming. It's hard to do because this world of development is just crazy, right? And especially affordable housing, like all of us that are in affordable housing, we just talk about how it's rocket science because it's so hard. So I just want to lead off with that. Like it's a very hard industry and it's very hard to complete and do for an array of reasons. But yes, Bienestar reaches out to community. We're connected. Where we build currently is Hillsborough, Forest Grove, and Cornelius. So I have the luxury to have a community that's very specific, right, on who we're serving right now. And what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing is the need of larger units. You know, Obaldo just talked about a family and, you know, them going without housing for a year and a half. Well, I can kind of understand how that happens, you know, as a developer. We had a family reach out to us a couple of months ago who had finished the blueberry season, didn't make enough money to migrate back to where they were going to go from Oregon. And so reached out to Bienestar to look for housing because we're one of very few developers in the entire state that build 4-bedroom units. And for those that don't know the rule of affordable housing regulations, it's 2 people per bedroom and 1 in the living room. So if you have a family of 9, you need a 4-bedroom. We cannot house them in a 3-bedroom. We're out of compliance. So 2, 4, 6, 8, and 9, that family of 9 would barely get into our 4-bedroom apartment. The problem, we don't have any that are opened, right? And we don't have a lot of developers out there building 4 bedrooms because of what they like to say, it doesn't pencil. Even sometimes when you do get developers out there building larger, thanks to Metro Bond, they're asking you that you build minimum 2 bedrooms or higher. The parking is an issue with Latinx community, right? And sometimes we see families even could possibly turn away housing at a development because there's 0 parking. And how do you have 0 parking set aside for a family of 9? And especially, you know, if the husband is in construction or landscaping, they need a safe place to park that trailer, to park that truck, because that is their main source of income, right? Is making sure that they have a place to continue doing their work. So I think another need that we're seeing, that I'm seeing as a developer that is newer, is senior housing. A couple of the people talked earlier about what homelessness looks like within the Latinx community, and it's living on your grandma's couch or your grandpa or your uncle's couch, right? It's living in their garage. I've heard of tons of my personal friends who let me know what homelessness looked like for them growing up and how they were homeless in high school. And it was waiting at the library, you know, until their parents came to get them after work, and then figuring out whose house, whose tia's or cousin's house they were going to move to or stay at that night, until somebody could convert a garage possibly. So even if you have a garage, you're still homeless, you know, at any moment you can get kicked out or something can happen, right? So with that said, now we're seeing something new in the Latinx community or what I wanted to say with that is that homelessness exists. It's just that we're not necessarily out on the streets. You're not seeing it that way, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a high need of homelessness within the Latinx community. There is. What we are now unfortunately seeing, especially in Hillsborough, is an uptick in seniors in the Latinx community becoming homeless, and or now going back to that, what Ubaldo was talking about earlier, their children are born and raised in the US, and their parents didn't make enough savings or didn't get the opportunity to do retirement. And so now they're becoming dependent on their younger children, right? And that's a new set of homelessness wave that we're seeing come through in Western Washington County. And so building even 1 bedrooms within the larger bedroom units, developments to allow intergenerational families to stay in place and build what Erika was talking about earlier, which is that community, right? Because they're going to depend on grandma and grandpa to watch their children later on. So I'll speak on that. I think your other question was on home ownership. Is that what? And can you just repeat the question for me real fast? Because there's like 3 questions in that.
What are some barriers to owning a home?
Yeah, I think Chelsea hit it on the head. It's the down payment. Right now in or not even Western, in Washington County, get into a starter home, $400,000. In order to get in to buy that house, you need an income of at least $65,000. And that is with very, very little debt. So no $500 car payment, student loans are a barrier in order to get that. And then you get to the down payment of getting into that $400,000 house. And depending on whether or not you're going to be able to put your closing costs in to the loan or you're going to pay for them out, either results into $22,000 all the way up to $30,000 for that down payment, right? So Chelsea talked about the IDA as helping, and I am a champion of an IDA. I used an IDA several years ago when I bought my first house. I got in. I think the issue right now with the IDA is that the numbers that I just gave you, a minimum of $65,000 is what you need to make with very little debt to get into that $400,000 home. You're not qualifying for an IDA. You're over income at that point. So there's a lot of education that needs to be thrown out into our community to capture somebody before they get an increase, because you can be in an IDA for up to 3 years. So if you start a little bit earlier and you can squeeze in and you know that you're going to be making income, you're probably one of very few people that can strategically get in there and get into home ownership. Otherwise, an IDA, unfortunately, isn't going to be, you're not going to qualify for it. You're not going to be able to get into that home. And I know that there's different prices across the state right now. Like I said, I'm still a champion of the IDA. I love the IDA program. I think it's great. But I do see across the board in policy changes that need to be made. Those MFI, those medium family income limits, they need to raise if we're really going to start helping families get in and also get assistance with that down payment that they need to start building wealth. And then your last question real quick was about developers.
Yes, about Latinx developers.
This
and
is
the
my
lack of
passion.
that. Okay, tell us.
This is my passion. And I know that we're going to get to questions, so I'll just do it as fast as I can on my speech. When I got into development, it was just 3 years ago. And I've had a passion for real estate. I've been in housing for 10 years. And I always wanted to learn how to become a developer. Absolutely loved it. It's not easy to get into. I'm going to skip on the story how I got in, but now that I'm in, I can count on one hand right now how many Latinx developers I know across the state in this. And what I can let you know right now is the decisions being made on behalf of our community is just crazy. Thousands and thousands of units are going to be coming out. And to know that currently I only get to oversee 263 of those new units coming out makes me wonder how other developers are sitting down and doing a match for our community, right? Like Erika, I'm sitting here listening to you and I'm already thinking like, I wonder if we can get down and help and talk, because what's important to me is to understand that the developer on there is there to listen to you and to your community. And development happens so fast, and there's a million decisions that need to be made that I understand how a lot of people don't stop and ask the community or engage them or bring them to the table, because it's really hard, right? And people have different ideas of what they want and what they like and what they need, but it's something that needs to be done. Like, we need to be able to do that if you're going to do it right, because the worst thing that can happen as a developer is that you develop it and then the people that you intended to develop it for do not come, right? And I have seen that happen before, and it is very upsetting. And I just really hope that doesn't happen, in the communities that have opportunities to rebuild right now. And then in addition, what I'll also advocate for is that more people come to learn development. If you're interested, come and let me know. I really do want to get that out there, and I want to help the next generation understand how they can sit at the table and get into the wonderful world of development, but also more importantly, give our community back the power to own and operate affordable housing projects across the state. They should be owned and operated by Latinx community, because at the end of the day, if something happens like the 4 years that we passed in the last presidency, I can't tell you how important it was for Bienestar to be the owner operator, as people were seeing ICE come on the property and arrest family members and stake out our housing. You know, like if we didn't have leadership that was Latinx and it wasn't personal, I don't necessarily know that other EDs would even pick up that as a problem, or that would mobilize as fast as we did, or that would care as much as we did, right? We understand those problems, that's our family, that's our community. It's not going to happen on our watches. So I advocate for any way that I can help people own and operate affordable housing developments within their communities too, by the correct culturally specific people. So Maria, thank you. I'll pass it over to you now.
Thank you, Erika. I think I will say this because I say this in every meeting that I'm at where I have an audience. This is, you've given us a great example of why inclusion matters. Erika, that was a perfect example. Thank you. Kaylin, I'm going to give it back to you for opening us up for questions and answers. I know that some questions came through on the chat. So if you'll lead us, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. I'll just invite you, if you do have questions that you have not yet put in the chat, feel free to put it in the public chat. If you would prefer to submit it anonymously, you can privately message me. But I will start with the question about IDA programs. And we had a specific one about how they're organized and if they are usually based on a geographic service area.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that. It's a really great question. Yes, the fiduciary organizations that we work with, they are mostly based on geography. They may include more than one county, or they may just be very specific to one county. And I can, once we're done, I can provide a little bit more information, maybe a link to what those organizations and their catchment areas. I also want to just add to what Erika Calderon mentioned around the yes and, right? IDA match savings is awesome. And yes, and I would also say the same thing actually for some of our affordable housing development, right? It's like there are some policies that we got to be thinking about that we might need to shift, because what we're talking about now in terms of poverty is people are working. Like most of the time, I think historically we thought about poverty as folks maybe they're not working, right? Or maybe they're on a fixed income, and all of that is true. And it's also true that people are working 40 plus hours a week and still cannot maintain basic housing. And that is a problem, right? And so when we're starting to think about the median family incomes and the area median incomes, all of those different income, we need to be thinking about how to broaden it so that we can have more people access those dollars. And then I think on the affordable housing development side, I just want to quickly note around we got to be thinking about how we incentivize, right? Because it is more expensive to build larger units. It might require a bigger subsidy per unit to build. And how do we incentivize and give more money, right? So that it's easier to develop those larger units. Those are the specific policy implications that we have to be thinking about. And just one more thing to Ubaldo's point around undocumented community members, such a great point around, we are talking about folks who actually pay taxes and who are not able to benefit from the programs that their taxes actually pay for. It's bananas, right? And so I just really appreciate you for bringing that into the conversation, because I think it's something that we have to be thinking about in state government, where we're missing the mark, particularly with that piece. So just much appreciation.
Thank you, Chelsea. Kaylin, did we have other questions from the group?
We had some great comments, and that was our one direct question. So if you all have any other notes that you want to speak more on, we have a little bit more time for that.
So I have a question for the entire panel. So as nonprofit and community leaders, what do you want funders and others working to address this issue to know. So just a sentence of the things, those salient points, and may we bless all of these little seeds that you are planting right now, that they germinate into beautiful ideas for our family. Ubaldo, you're up.
Yes, thank you. So one of the things that I want from organizations and state officials and federal officials is to create a system that fits our needs. One of the things is, till today, we have a system that they want to apply to the Latino community or immigrant communities or people of color communities that don't fit our community. So we need a system that fits our community, not try to force a community to fit into that system. Because this is one of the things that we have regulations and we always default to that. Oh, we can do that because the law doesn't allow us to do that because that's the law, but the law don't fit our community. We need laws that they are designed to our community's needs. Other ways, those laws are gonna be just nothing for us and they're gonna perpetuate that crisis.
Thank you, Ubaldo. Who else wants to answer that question?
I'll jump in. So outputs are good, but centering outcomes is even better. And those outcomes should be reflective of what community centers and should be focused on not meeting a bare minimum, but really be focused on how we make sure people actually thrive and do better than the bare minimum. But we're not going to know that unless we actually talk to community. So.
Thank you, Chelsea. Erica, any thoughts, lasting thoughts? We've got just a couple more minutes.
I think for me, it's like, I'd love to see, I mean, all levels, you know, of leadership invest in alternative housing models like land trusts, cooperatives. A group of 70 community members spoke about putting money together to buy land, you know, and so the ideas are there, you know, like everyone has mentioned, community has the solutions. We just need to listen and advocate for that funding to go to cultural specific organizations, or we don't have a cultural specific, you know, housing development group here in Southern Oregon. So it's like maybe something like that can grow from, you know, the housing need here, down here.
Thank you, Erika.
We have a minute. I want to echo Erika, you're so great today. Just your sentiment on that, right? I think that as a developer, a lot of times I wish that they would listen to what community wants to, right? Because I'd love to develop for you what your community needs. And all the funding comes with compliance. And sometimes I've even sat at tables before where people don't think that owning a manufactured home is creating wealth or building wealth, right? And I grew up in one. I lived in a manufactured home. We were lucky to own the land as well, but it did. You know, it landed me and it stabilized a home for me to go to school and to continue my education and feel safe. So I would just want them to listen to community, always listen to community and what that looks like for the community that you're building for, and allow that building to happen, you know.
Thank you, Erika. Thank you all so much to all our panelists. Really some incredible wisdom and lived experience. We're very, very grateful to have you all in your respective communities helping and centering the voices of the Latinx community and particularly the undocumented community. Ubaldo, thank you so much for your service. So we are John, Kaylin, will you give us everyone instructions on how to get back to the main group? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all for joining, and an extra big thank you for all of the panelists for sharing your expertise. I just put in the chat a link to return to the main session where we'll hear closing remarks from our Director of Community Engagement. So I'll stay here if you have any questions, but again, you can find that link to return to the main session in the chat. Thank you.